Hello, my name is Mike Finan, and I live in Austin, Texas. I've lived and worked in Austin for almost 40 years, but I'm not here today to really tell you that story. What I'd like to tell you about is my life and experiences living in Winter Park, Florida in the 1960s and 1970s, and especially my experiences with the Langford Hotel in Winter Park and the Langford family. The story starts in Chicago, where my family is originally from. My father, Emmett Finan, was an accountant and auditor in Chicago. And he worked for an accounting firm that specialized in hospitality businesses, hotels and restaurants and so forth. And in the course of his work there, he obtained an account for the Del Prado Hotel in Chicago, which is a large hotel. It's located on South Shore Drive, about 400 rooms. And in the course of performing regular audits and providing accounting advice for the hotel in Chicago, he became good friends with the owner of the hotel, R.L. Langford. And after working there for approximately 20 years, he also developed a relationship with R.L. Langford's son, Bob Langford, who later built the hotel in Winter Park, Florida. And my connection with Winter Park begins in 1962, when, as a result of my father doing an audit for the Langford Hotel in Winter Park, he ended up staying longer than expected that particular year, and as a result of that, my mother and I eventually came down to join him. It was quite a transition for me. I was a happy kid in a suburban neighborhood in Chicago, and I was conflicted about the move. Obviously, I was scared, have to move to a new town and leave all my friends behind, and so forth. My dad came up near the summer of '62 with by plane, but he drove our car, which was a 1960 Chevy Impala. I remember it very well. It was a convertible, and we drove it down to Florida. It was a long trip, probably the longest road trip I've ever been on in my life at that point. And I would have been about 9 years old when we came down to Florida. I remember my first impressions of pulling into Winter Park and the Langford Hotel was when we hit this noise, which is very distinctive. It was like a washboard sound of the tires rolling over a brick street. And I was sort of asleep in the back of the car, and I remembered sitting up and looking around, and the first thing I noticed was there's a completely different flora atmosphere than what I was used to in Chicago. The trees were different. We had palm trees and palmetto bushes and live oak trees. It was a startling difference. And as we pulled into the hotel lobby area and I got out of the car, the first thing that caught my attention, of course, was the Olympic-sized pool that they had at the Langford. And that was a remarkable thing to see because the pool was so large. In Chicago, you don't get to go swimming that much for obvious reasons. Most of my swimming had been done in Lake Michigan on beaches there, but the pool was enormous, and so that was a really exciting thing to see. As it turned out, that summer I was pretty much alone, but the Langford family sort of adopted me. Beatrice Langford, Bob Langford's wife, was a really beautiful person, very petite lady, very friendly, easygoing, and she brought me to their house. I remember being over at their house. They had a house on Lake Maitland, and we would swim there, and I played with their older with Bobby Langford, who was their youngest son, but he was about 5 years older than me at the time. And I also remember being welcomed by Jerry Langford, one of Bob Langford's daughters. And so I felt welcomed when I came. I spent most of my days that summer in 1962 swimming in the pool at the Langford. I was there like a fish in the morning and in the afternoons, and enjoyed it a great deal. However, you know, after a week or so, the novelty sort of wears off, and then you realize that you're alone. And I didn't have any, there were no permanent friends at that point because I was living at a hotel, and the kids that came to the hotel to stay were there for a day or two, and then they were gone. The unique thing about the pool was it also had 3 diving boards, which was unusual. Most of the motels and even hotels in those days, they rarely had a diving board, and if they did have a diving board, it was a very short diving board. These were Olympic measured diving boards. There was 2 1-meter boards and a 3-meter board, which people call a high dive. And they all were at one end of the pool. My days spent there swimming, I learned to swim better because the morning lifeguard, Frank Siak, who I became befriended, and he taught me the correct way to swim. When I came to Florida, I was not a particularly good swimmer, but he helped me along, and I was always grateful for that. And by the end of the summer, I was a good swimmer, thanks to him. But he was an interesting man. He came from Hungary. He, I believe, was on the Hungarian Olympic swim team at one time. And he was a terrific diver. He did very complicated dives off the 3-meter board. So he was a good person to have around, especially in the mornings at the pool. Then an important thing happened to me one day. A young boy about my age showed up at the pool, and I remember that I was hanging off the edge of the pool, just kind of looking around, and I spotted him coming in, and he threw his towel down, and I looked away, and the next thing I know, his foot was up right next to my face, and he said, "Hey, you want to see my foot?" And I looked down at his foot, and he only had 3 toes on one foot. And so he was happy to tell me the story about how he lost his other 2 toes. And surprisingly, I also had a bicycle accident when I was about the same age as him, at 5 years of age, where I broke my ankle. And so we had those 2 stories in common. And from that day on, he became my best friend, and I still keep in touch with him to this day. So we've been friends for over 50 years. The other thing that was exciting about Jim, my friend, is that his parents had a house in Winter Park on Alexander Place. And Alexander Place was right across from the Langford Hotel. About a block from the hotel their house was located on Lake Osceola. And so I spent many days after school going down to his house. The Langfords in 1948 built the Langford Apartments, and that was a enterprise that they started there. And that was sort of the beginning of development for the Langfords in Winter Park. In 1955, Bob Langford, R.L. Langford's son, built the Langford Resort Hotel. And at that time, the Langford Resort Hotel was unique for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the first hotel in the Central Florida area that had central air conditioning. Many of the hotels in Winter Park did not have air conditioning because they were primarily seasonal hotels. And people came down during the winter months and wintered there, and then went back to the north, where whatever city they came from, and the hotels were pretty much closed up for the summer months. So the idea of operating a hotel year-round in Central Florida, and especially in Winter Park, was unheard of. So that was another unique thing about the hotel, is that it was a year-round hotel. And the hotel title, the Langford Resort Hotel, is really critical in understanding why the Langford Hotel was different. It was conceived by Bob Langford to be a resort-style hotel, meaning that it had unique setting, a unique property, unique atmosphere. The hotel, with the Olympic-sized pool, also had beautifully landscaped grounds. It had a flamingo pen with flamingos and egrets, which were native to Florida. And so somebody came to the hotel, it was a very resort-like experience. They knew they were in something that was not just a standard hotel that you would find on the side of a highway. Bob Langford, of course, could have built a hotel on a major highway and immediately done a lot of business that way, but that was not his vision for the hotel. He also was very particular about how the hotel was laid out. It occupied a whole city block. And the other thing about the hotel was it was sitting in pretty much a residential neighborhood. So that also added a lot of value in terms of the sensation that you are not sitting by a highway, that you're actually in a sort of a more secluded area, in a quieter area. It was very relaxing to be there. The hotel had other features that were unusual. I mentioned the flamingos and the egrets, but it also had a pair of macaws, which were pretty exotic birds if you don't see up north unless you go to a zoo. There was two macaws, and they were named Mac and Millie, and they were very entertaining and beautiful birds to see. I do remember on one occasion Mac got out of his cage and flew around the hotel, and they had to get the fire department to get him out of the tree. And on another occasion, one of the flamingos, even though they used to keep their wings trimmed, actually on a windy day got enough wind behind his wings and flew up. And I remember being at the pool and watching the flamingo fly over the pool. And because his wings were trimmed a little bit, he was unable to clear the building. So he kind of made this pivot and dive and came back and ended up landing in the middle of the pool. We lived in the main part of the hotel for about a year. And my father was still undecided about whether he was going to go back to Chicago and back to work for the accounting firm, or whether we were going to stay in Florida. But as the school year came closer, then my mother enrolled me in St. Margaret Mary's school, which was located on the north end of Park Avenue. And my friend Jim went to Park Avenue Elementary, and that was on the other end of Park Avenue. The Langford Hotel was a 5-story hotel. It had actually a 6th floor that was a banquet room called the Treetop Room. And when Bob Langford built the hotel, he was very particular about trying to keep as many of the trees that were on the lot as possible because they were valuable. They were old trees and they were very tall. Construction practices in those days was usually to just level the lot and build from there. They didn't save the trees, but Bob Langford was, one of the first people, I think, that saw the value of not taking out all the trees and shrubs and everything and trying to preserve some of the natural landscape. But yes, it was about a 100-room hotel, 5 stories, and it would have been the tallest building in Winter Park at that time. We had a suite on the 5th floor of the hotel, and I was little, self-conscious about living in the main part of the hotel in the first year we were there, because I always had to be on my best behavior, and there wasn't a lot of running allowed or acting as a normal 9-year-old boy. So at times it was a little difficult for me, but it was also very exciting to be at the hotel because there was always something going on, and there was always a great deal of activity around the pool. The hotel also had 2 restaurants, so it was a full-service hotel. Plus it had a beauty salon and some other commercial stores there at the hotel. It certainly was probably more expensive than staying at a motel on a highway. I'm sure it was. But I don't think it was especially expensive. As I became more familiar with Winter Park in that first year, I really grew to appreciate it because I had the hotel, and now I had a friend that lived near the hotel. And incidentally, I think Jim and I were about the only 2 kids the same age in that whole area of Park Avenue, the hotel. That central area of Winter Park at that time was occupied by a lot of older people that owned the houses around the hotel and lived in the Langford apartments. And so there were a lot of retirees in Winter Park at that time. And so it was very good fortune that we found each other, because at that time in your life, you don't really have the capacity to seek out friends that you may be going to school with, but may live a great distance from where you live. And but we did roam to the downtown area, Park Avenue, on our bicycles quite frequently. And we became very familiar with the shopkeepers and business owners of downtown Winter Park. And the important thing about Winter Park in the early 60s is that it was a complete town. And what I mean by that, it had all the essential things that one would need to survive. It had a grocery store, a hardware store, a pharmacy, actually several pharmacies, and a movie theater. And it was, in many ways, it was a small town like many or thousands of other small towns in the country, but it had some other unique features, I think, and one of those things was the chain of lakes that it was so close to. There were 3 primary lakes in Winter Park: Lake Osceola, which was near the Langford Hotel, Lake Virginia, which Rollins College was very close to, and Lake Maitland. And the interesting thing is, all 3 of those lakes were joined by a canal system, so you could actually go by boat from one lake to the other. My mother, when we lived in the hotel, even when we had a suite, we had a small kitchen area, and she used to send me down to the Marquetessen to buy a pound of hamburger or get some other groceries. A strange coincidence, my friend Jim Jernigan was down in Florida and down in Winter Park, and he went to the museum, and he was looking at the exhibit, and he was looking for something to send to me, because we've always had this connection with Winter Park. And he found the video, Ed's video, and he sent the video to me. And I was so pleased to see it, because it's a lost history now that the hotel is not there anymore. And it did affect a lot of people's lives. There were people that had their weddings at the Langford Hotel. It was the iconic social center of Winter Park. Park Avenue area was a wonderful street that probably went maybe 4, 5, 6 blocks. And as I said, it was capped by Park Avenue Elementary on one end and St. Margaret Mary's Church and Elementary School on the other end. But the central business district was all within about a 2-block area. There was the bus stop for the buses in Winter Park, the City Hall, the Winter Park City Hall that was right on Lyman Avenue, the police headquarters on Lyman Avenue, and then going from Lyman Avenue to New England Avenue, most of the commercial businesses existed there. And some of the ones I wanted to talk about, which are fond memories for me, first of all would have been Colony Theater. My friend Jim and I spent many Saturday afternoons watching films at the Colony Theater, and that was an important entertainment venue for people living in Winter Park, especially for kids. A funny thing they did, this is a kind of a side story, but Royal Crown Cola, which was a Southern cola company, competitor for Coca-Cola, had a summer film festival for the kids at the Colony Theater. And so you could pay cash to get in to see the summer film festival that was like every Saturday morning for about a month during the summer months. And, or you could bring 6 bottle caps for like a 6-pack of Royal Crown Cola. Jim and I found a clever way to get in free by going around to the Coke machines on Park Avenue and the machines that also carried other products like Royal Crown Cola. And we would pull the bottle caps out of there was a dispenser. So when you bought your bottle of soda, you opened the bottle right there and the cap went down into this little trap. And we would go around on our bikes and pull the caps out and collect them so that we could get into the Summer Film Festival for free. So that was a fun thing we did as kids. On the same side of the street as Colony Theater, there was a dress store, a ladies' dress store. There was Frucci Audio, which sold stereo equipment and hi-fi stereos for the people that lived in the area. There was also the Marquetessen grocery store, like I mentioned before. There was an appliance store, sold TVs and other appliances, and a woman's, or I should say a fabric store that sold bolts of fabric, and a Western Auto store that sold hardware and for cars, and also where Jim and I used to get parts for our bicycles. On the other side of Park Avenue in that area was the Toggery clothes store that catered to the students at Rollins College. It had the preppy fashions for the Rollins College students. Also, there was another very important shop business that Jim and I frequented, was the O'Brien's Pharmacy. And it was the typical old town pharmacy that also had a soda fountain with the stools, swivel stools, and a lunch area with booths. And it was an old pharmacy. And like I said, many of the businesses and other commercial buildings in Winter Park back, I would say, prior to the early 60s, didn't have air conditioning. So I remember in the pharmacy they had the large ceiling fans going all the time. And Jim and I used to spend Friday nights sometimes having dinner there together. We would buy our hamburger and milkshake or whatever, and for 65, 85 cents, and whatever money we got back from our dollar we would spend on candy. But that was a important place for us. Also on that side of the street was Hoag's Five and Dime store, and there was a toy store, and the barber shop that Jim and I used to go to, which on the window of the barber shop was the name of the owner of the barber shop. And we thought for many years that it said Dr. Smith barber shop. And then one day we realized that the periods separated the D and the R were actually had been washed off by many years of washing the window. So it was D.R. Smith and not Dr. Smith. But that was always a joke between us. But also at the end of, or at the corner of New England and Park Avenue was the First National Bank, which many people banked at there in Winter Park, and including the Langford Hotel had their accounts there at the First National Bank. The important thing about, and the reason I'm telling you about these businesses, is that they were all family-owned businesses. And later, what happened around the end of the decade of the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, they built a mall in Winter Park. And a lot of those family-owned businesses eventually went away. And Winter Park is a much different place now than it was back in the 60s. It was sort of gentrified at some point after Disney World opened. And so Park Avenue now is a collection of restaurants and high-end boutiques. There were a number of famous people that stayed at the Langford Hotel. And unfortunately, I didn't get to meet many of them because when they came to the Langford Hotel, they were there because of the secluded nature of the hotel, not being in the center of business activity or on a major highway. They came there to relax. And so, and the employees knew that, and they tried to, give them as much space as possible and not bother them. So a lot of time we had celebrities staying at the Langford Hotel that many of the employees that unless they checked them into the hotel would not have known they were there. Roy and Walt Disney came and stayed at the Langford Hotel sort of clandestinely back in the early 60s, and were searching out areas to build another Disneyland, which of course they called Disney World. But the Disney brothers stayed at the hotel, and that was an important surveying mission that they went on, and they eventually did open Disney World in the late 60s. And that had a significant impact on Orlando and Winter Park and all of the surrounding towns, Kissimmee, because what wasn't just the development and opening of Disney World, but the commercial explosion that occurred after the opening of Disney World. Of course, many other entertainment venues came down and opened things there, SeaWorld and Universal City, and the hotels and things that were built out there around Disney World changed the landscape quite a bit and changed a lot of things in Winter Park. It was like a tsunami of commercial activity after Disney World opened. And Orlando and Winter Park were never the same after that. And about that same time, Winter Park Mall opened. And people immediately started doing all their shopping at the Winter Park Mall, which was typical of what happened throughout the whole country. It wasn't unique to Winter Park, but it was an unfortunate thing that had to happen because you lose that personal touch and personal, relationship with the shopkeepers when they're basically driven out of business by a larger commercial development like a mall. Every year they had a art festival in downtown Winter Park, and that was a big event for everybody. And they had artists from all over the country that came there every year and set up booths. And it spanned the full length of Park Avenue, and including there was a park off of Park Avenue, and they set up their booths and displayed all their artwork. And I remember it was usually in March, so the weather was beautiful and cool, and it was a fantastic thing, and it became very popular throughout all of Florida to go to the art festival in Winter Park. Jim and I, being as enterprising as we were back in those days, always looking for a way to earn some money, we hooked up with there was a small local newspaper printed in Winter Park, and that also printed advertising flyers and things like that. And we found out that we could sell the flyers that this publishing company would put out specifically for the art festival. And the reason that flyer was important is because it gave the location of all the artists and their booths along the Park Avenue area, and included a map so that it was easy for people that were looking for a particular artist to find them, because the crowds could get pretty large during the weekends, especially when the festival was going on. And so we had this publication that we used to sell, and I think it was sold for 25 cents, and Jim and I get one nickel for each one that we sold. And so that was another way that we made money when we were kids down there. Another place that Jim and I used to hang out down in Florida was scenic boat tours, which people that have visited Winter Park are probably familiar with. It's a very important tourist destination if you visit Winter Park, and it's been there for many years, going back to probably the 30s or the 40s, but it's gone through a number of different owners.
My name is Alec.
Is that when you were?
I'd like to welcome you to the tour, and you're going to enjoy this next hour. The tour will take us across 3 lakes that are connected by 2 canals.
In the 1960s, Jim and I used to go there after school. It was close to where his house was located, and we would either meet at his house or we would meet at the scenic boat tours. And we became friendly with the owners, Sam Colombo and Mike Farica, and it was really a pleasant place to go after school. It was a good place to hang out, and we would watch the tourists get loaded on the boats and go out, and we'd often have a soda there, maybe a candy bar, and we'd sit and look out onto the lake. The other thing we did, the scenic boat tours was very close to where the Seminole Hotel once existed, which was one of the original hotels in Winter Park that was later demolished. And it was one of those seasonal hotels that I talked about earlier. And it had a large lot, including a lakefront lot that was all grass, and it was covered by a canopy of trees. And it was a perfect place for Jim and I to play ball. So we played football, baseball year-round there until we outgrew the size of the lot. But we spent a lot of time either sitting on the dock at scenic boat tours or playing there, and I have a lot of fond memories of going there after school. The scenic boat tours was not only important as a tourist destination, but it was also important to people that owned boats on the lakes, because they had gasoline and oil there that was required for outboard motors, and people from all 3 lakes used to drive their boats over to Scenic to get their gas tanks filled. And occasionally, when the owners of the tour company were busy, we would help fill the tanks up with gas. The owners of the boats would take the 5-gallon tanks out of their boat, put them up on the dock, and we would fill them up with gas. And each tank had to have a quart of oil. And I remember turning this hand crank to get the quart of oil out, pouring it with a funnel into the tank, and then filling it up with gas. So that was another thing that we used to do that was a lot of fun for us. It was a lot of work for the people that owned it. It was a distraction when they were trying to get people on and off tour boats. But but we like to help them do that, and we had great times down there. A funny thing about our connection with the Scenic Boat Tours is that the owners knew us so well and trusted us so much that they used to allow us to have a charge account because the boat tours had a refrigerator, and they sold cold drinks and snack food for the people that came down there to take the boat tour. And we used to buy sodas there also, and if we didn't have the 25 cents or whatever it was for the soda, they would mark it on the back of their office wall there how much we owed them. And we about once a month, we tried to scrap together the money to pay them what we owed on our charge account. So that was a good lesson in responsible, learning responsibility with money, I think. When I reached the age of 14 or 15, an interesting thing happened one Sunday afternoon. I was in the Galleon restaurant dining room one Sunday having dinner with my parents, and the catering director and manager of the restaurants at the hotel came in a hurry and sat down at the table with my parents and I, and he looked at me and he looked at my parents and he said, "I need to borrow Mike for a few minutes." And my parents looked at him and were like, what for? And he said, "Well, we've got a problem. The busboy is sick and has left, and I don't have anybody to deliver this room service meal to a room in the hotel." So my parents just nodded, and he took me to the back in the kitchen where they had a large closet where they kept the uniforms for the waiters at the hotel. And I remember they, for many years, wore this red vest with a brass clip and a white shirt and a bow tie, which is kind of a typical uniform for a hotel. And he fitted me out in the uniform, and we got the cart prepared, and the meal was prepared by the cook, and he told me what to do, took it all up to the room, and the great thing about it was I got this big tip, which I think was $1. And the reason I'm telling that story is that started my career as a banquet waiter at the hotel. So from about age 15 until I was 19 years old, I worked part-time, mostly part-time, as a banquet waiter there at the hotel. And later, Jim, my friend, also worked at the hotel as a banquet waiter when we were in high school. And that was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of interesting banquets that we worked at. That we even, one of the things they had at the hotel that was very popular for conventions and conferences, people that wanted to have a big banquet at the hotel, is they had a luau. They could arrange to have a luau, and they would set the banquet tables around the Olympic pool. There was enough grounds and area there to set up tables for, I don't know, 100 to 200 people, and have and that was also a great atmosphere for people that wanted to have something different. And they had, the waiters wore Hawaiian shirts, and the waitresses had, Hawaiian-style dresses instead of the normal uniforms. And they really tried their best to make it a fun experience. Along with the banquets and conferences that they had at the hotel, one of the other unique features of the Langford Resort Hotel was the water shows that they used to put on for people that had their conferences or conventions there. And at the age of about 11, I got involved in one of the acts of the water shows that they put on as a clown. But there was a modeling studio that was located at the hotel. And just to be clear, it's not the kind of modeling or escort sort of thing that you hear about now, and you have that has that kind of connotation. This was a genuine professional modeling studio that was run by a lady by the name of Pat Fletcher. And she had a whole program where she taught young ladies that wanted to get into the modeling career how to walk and how to poise and do all of those things. And as a matter of fact, at the Winter Park Museum, there is a large photograph, color photograph, that actually came from one of the early brochures for the Langford Hotel. And there's a picture of the pool, and in the foreground of the picture, you can see some ladies that are standing with sort of typical model poses in high heels. And those were some of the models that worked at not worked at the studio, but were learning to become models at the studio. But the reason I bring this up is that Pat Fletcher used to also coordinate the water shows, and she worked with another person that I was very close with at the hotel, Hank Mast. And Hank was the pool manager, and he was in charge of hiring and keeping the chemicals balances correct in the pool. And he and Pat Fletcher used to work together to organize the water shows, and the water shows were divided up into a number of acts depending on what people were available to perform in the water shows. But the funniest part of the show and what I participated in was the clown act, and that involved Hank Mast dressing up as a woman. So Hank may have been one of the first Tootsies, if you get the movie reference. As I said, the show was divided up into a number of acts, but the best part of the show, in my opinion, I think what most people that were watching the show enjoyed the most, was the clown act. And the way it started, Pat Fletcher usually had her models. Some of them had talents, and they would come out and do some kind of a dance routine, or occasionally they would have a fashion show, and the models would do their, sort of the catwalk strut with their fashion bathing suits or whatever. And then Hank Mast, who was the pool manager, was a former Marine. So he was a kind of a tough guy, had the typical Marine haircut that he never gave up, very short hair. And he had this fondness for doing this clown act as a woman. And he would, if you can imagine, this tough kind of guy with a Marine background, donning women clothes. But the way the clown act would start, he would come over in drag with a cream pie. And he always had a name tag on. He would borrow one of the name tags, or one of those stick-on tags that the conventioneers always filled out, "My name is," and act like he was part of the conference crowd or the convention crowd. And he would interrupt Pat at the end of her show and say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm here." And Pat would talk to her and say, "Oh, you've brought a pie," and bada, bada, bada. Then one of the lifeguards, regular lifeguards, would come over and try to remove the lady, Hank, from interrupting the show. And then, of course, Hank would hit the lifeguard in the face with the pie, and that's how the clown act would start. And then he would trot over to the high dive with the high heels on, and by that time, everybody that's around the pool watching the water show was immediately focused on Hank because of the slapstick part of this. And he would climb up, and people were just amazed. He would climb up the ladder on the high dive in the high heel shoes. And then there was a folding chair that was placed up there before the show. And he would take the folding chair and he'd walk all the way out to the end of the diving board and put the folding chair down and sit on it, and then cross his legs and with the high heels, and kind of flick the high heels like some women do. And the people just loved it. They thought it was hilarious. And then, of course, the lifeguard followed him up to the top of the high dive and tried to remove him. And then when he didn't want to get down, of course, the lifeguard pushed him off the... And at this point, some people in the audience are still thinking that this is one of their members that's up there and had one drink too many. And people are really, really roaring now. And that started the whole clown act. And he would fall down into the water, and then he'd get out of the water, and he'd take the dress off, and he'd be in women's underwear with colored balloons sticking in the brassiere, and people were just, startled, but also found it extremely hilarious. And then I won't go into the rest of the details on that. It was an important entertainment feature of the hotel, and I'm fairly certain at that time in the 60s, and this would have been before Disney World, there was no other hotel in Orlando or Central Florida area that did a water show for their conferences or conventions. So it was unique. The other parts of the show were very good too. Hank Mass was an accomplished diver, and Frank Siak, who I mentioned earlier, lifeguard that was there for a number of years in the morning, he would come back and they would do real professional dives off the high dive. 1.5 gainers, 2.5 somersaults with full twist. Both of them were very accomplished divers, and that was a good part of the show also. In the finale, I want to talk just briefly about the finale of the show. As I mentioned before, Bob Langford was very conscientious about trying to preserve as much as the original trees around the hotel when the hotel was built. And there was a grapefruit tree that was located very close to one of the diving boards and on the side of one of the pool. And for the end of the show, Hank would climb up into the grapefruit tree to one of the higher branches, and they would put a spotlight on him to show him that he was up in the tree, to show the audience that he was up in the tree. And then the lifeguard that was also in the clown act would take this bowl of a propellant, like kerosene or gasoline, and he would throw it onto the water, and in this area between the edge of the pool and the first 1 meter board, which was an area of about maybe 6 or 7 feet, it wasn't a very big area, and light the propellant, and the flames would shoot up out of the water, and Hank would dive straight into the flames. And that was, the finale of the show, and people were amazed. Now with television and the internet, those sort of things are not that, special. But back in the early 60s, that was an unusual thing to see. And I remember later when Frank was not always available to help with the water show, I sometimes had to throw the propellant onto the water, and God help me if I didn't get the gasoline in the right spot. I would always hear it from Hank while he was up in the grapefruit tree, but I actually got pretty proficient at doing it so that nobody was harmed, nothing was burned. The main dining room of the hotel was called the Empire Room, and it was a supper club. So what I mean by that is it had entertainment. It was not just a restaurant, but it also had entertainment. And they had a band that played there every night, and a dance floor, and many of the residents of Winter Park used to come there to dance, have dinner and dance. 3 nights a week, at certain times of the year, they had floor shows. And I remember a number of the different floor shows they had. They had Cuban Review with music and dancing. They had a magician that used to come and do a magical act. They had comedians that were well known that used to come there and perform. They had, in the winter months, they had a ice show, believe it or not. They would put a small ice skating rink on the dance floor, and they had an ice review. And the one particular show that I remember the most, and this performer's name was Eddie Peabody, and he was a banjo player. Kind of an unusual act to have, but extremely entertaining. And Mr. Peabody was in the Navy and had a long career as a musician, but his act was, I remember it well because he was not only a great musician, but he was a great entertainer. And he always talked to the audience during the show, and he had one particular number that he used to play the banjo. It was a very fast-paced number, and he used to sit on this stool. Mr. Peabody was not a particularly tall or a big person, but he was probably in his 50s, I would say, when I was a kid. But he would start playing this very fast-paced tune, and he would start jumping up on the stool. And before long, he was jumping about 3 feet off the stool and coming back down while he was still playing the banjo. And I remember that very well. It was very entertaining. And I got to meet him. He sat at our table when we were dining in the Empire Room. And I still have a record. He actually had record contract, put out a number of albums. And I have one of the 33 records that he put out, and it's signed by him, Eddie Peabody, on the back. Best wishes. There wasn't a whole lot to do on Park Avenue after 6 p.m., after the shops closed and everything. The only entertainment venue was the Colony Theater. So the hotel provided night entertainment for adults, and for that reason it was also very well appreciated and liked. A little job that I had, unofficial job. The engineer at the hotel usually ran the lights. They had a light booth towards the back of the Empire Room, and for the floor shows they had spotlights and colored lights and lighting effects for the various floor shows to enhance the show. And one of the engineers that I befriended at the hotel when I was about 10 or 11 years old, he used to allow me once in a while to go up into the light booth for the first show. And I would go up in the light booth and help him operate the spotlights for the show. And that was always a thrilling thing to do. And some of the shows required very complicated lighting effects, and so you really needed 3 hands to operate. There was like 3 different spotlights, and so that was a fun thing that I got to do when I was at the hotel. The jobs that I had at the hotel, I mentioned earlier, I worked as a catering waiter for a number of years until I went into the Army at age 18. And I also worked as a lifeguard at the hotel later on. When I was about 17 years old, I think I started working. Hank hired me. And one summer, I worked alongside his daughter, which Becky Mast was about, I'd say 3 or 4 years older than I was. But she was really a sweet, lovely person. Sort of petite, blonde-haired girl, and she also taught me to drive a manual transmission car. She had a Volkswagen, which was a very common car to have for a young person back in those days, and she taught me how to drive her car before I got my driver's license. Becky also was in the water show. She did a paddleboard routine where she did some gymnastic maneuvers on a paddleboard while it was in the pool moving, which is not an easy thing to do. And that was another part of the show I didn't mention earlier, but she was very talented in that respect, and always enjoyed working with Becky. Some of the other employees I want to talk about at the hotel, because there were a number of employees that I worked with or I knew at the hotel. And I mentioned Hank Mast and Frank Siak. They were usually known as Hanko and Franco. That's what they called each other. But also, and when I started working as a waiter, banquet waiter, I became familiar with many of the people that worked in the kitchen. And one particular person I remember was Moses Johnson, I believe his last name was. He was the chef at the hotel, and he went by the name of Mo. And I worked with him for 5 or 6 years, seeing him on a regular basis. There were also some of the front desk clerks I knew very well. The bartender, one of the bartenders at the hotel that I knew well was Mike, and not that I was in the bar myself when I was a youngster, but I knew him, and his predecessor, his name was John. I knew Jim Louth, who was the catering manager that came to get me that one Sunday evening to take the room service card up. I worked with him for many years, knew him well. Of course, there were 3 office workers in my dad's office. Marge Johnson, who later remained working for the Langford family even after the hotel was closed. She eventually became the manager of the Langford Apartments, which I mentioned earlier. And Denise Shergy was an important person also in my life. I spent many weekends over at her house when I was new at the hotel and didn't have any friends. She used to take me over to her house on the weekends, and she had a son who was about my age. The atmosphere at the Langford Resort Hotel was such that employees enjoyed working there as much as the guests enjoyed staying there. And it was a very calm and happy environment. And as a result of that, many of these employees that I've mentioned worked at the hotel for over 10 years. And if you think about it, that's such an unusual thing nowadays, especially the hotel business or the restaurant business. There's a huge amount of turnover. Most people don't stay at one particular restaurant or one particular hotel for a very long period of time unless you're the manager. But these employees, many of them worked there for 10 years or more, and I think it was because they enjoyed their job so much. Winter Park, especially back in the 60s, was very much like a southern town. I mean, it had a lot of southern charm, but it also had some of the trappings of southern towns at that time, including segregation. But during my whole lifetime living in Winter Park and going through the history of the 1960s with the civil rights movement, there never seemed to be a lot of tension or hostility in Winter Park among the races. And I think that's another very important factor and attribute of the city and something that it can be proud of. There was a professor at Rollins College that lived at the Langford Hotel. I wanted to mention him briefly. His name was Paul Douglas, and he was a professor of political science. And I got to know him very well because he lived at the hotel. And even though I was not a college student when I met him, we used to see him. My parents and I would have dinner with him occasionally on Sundays at the hotel. And I remember having great conversations with him, and he was a very interesting man to hear. He had an amazing career as a professor of political science, and he had a lot of great stories to tell. And I learned a great deal from him just in conversations. I learned at a very early age how to communicate with adults and how to get along with adults and how to not be afraid to talk to adults or ask questions. And it's an important lesson to learn at an early age, because if you can interact successfully with adults, I think it helps in your educational process. And that was one advantages for me living at the hotel. In a way, I sort of was raised as an only child from about the age 9, because I would have been separated from my brothers who were still in Chicago. Another interesting thing is my father, as I mentioned earlier, didn't really think he was going to stay at the Langford Hotel as the accountant and auditor there forever. I think he was looking at his mission in 1962 as sort of a temporary assignment. And it was just a matter of factors that collided that delayed his stay and resulted in my mother and I coming down. And even after living there for a while, for a year or two, it was never really certain that we were going to stay there. My parents still owned a house in Chicago, and there was always the possibility we were going to return to Chicago. After living at the hotel for about 6 years, first on the main part of the hotel, and then later there was an apartment above my dad's office in another section of the hotel. The hotel was actually built in different stages. Talk about that just briefly. But there were the original hotel of 100 rooms that was 5 stories, and then they added a pavilion area where the restaurants were located, and they built a banquet pavilion on top of where the restaurants were located. So there was a second floor there. And then directly across the pool from the main hotel, there was another building that had about, I would say, 20 or 25 rooms. And at the end of that building was my dad's office. And there were a few other offices connected there. And right above that office was an apartment. And we lived in that apartment for about 4 or 5 years. And when I was in high school at age about 16 or 17, we moved out of the hotel. And that's when I first realized that we were probably going to stay in Winter Park. And I was thankful for that, having established relationships. I stayed in Florida and continued to work at the hotel until I was about 18, going on 19. As I said, when I went in the Army, that was the end of my career at the hotel. But when I was in college, I actually worked as a salesman at Frucci Audio, which stayed in business for a number of years. And it was that was an enjoyable experience also. It really was a beautiful place, and I think it still is a beautiful place, but it's a different place now. And one of the reasons it's so much different is the Langford Resort Hotel is not there anymore. But Winter Park, with its lakes, with its southern charm, with its atmosphere, with its festivals, it was a wonderful place to grow up. And of course, back in those days, a young boy had the freedom of movement without any concern about safety. The lasting thing is the memories that I've kept over these years. I probably have a unique perspective about the hotel as a resident and also as an employee. There are many takeaways about the Langford Hotel. Besides being a full-service hotel, it was a resort hotel, and it had unique flavor to it. And I mentioned earlier about the exotic birds they had there, the flamingos and the macaws and the egrets. But over the years, Bob Langford always was trying to make the hotel better, make it a unique experience to stay at the hotel. And he did that in a number of ways that were subtle, but also very memorable for most of the guests and people that visited the hotel. The other thing about the hotel was it was a focal point and almost served as the community center for people that lived in that area of Winter Park. Many people came there to use the pool, the Langford allowed for pool memberships for people that were not staying at the hotel. So there were many families like my friend Jim, who used to come up to the pool because of a pool membership. There was a limited number that they could allow because it was not a city pool, but that was something that the hotel did not have to do, but they did it as being part of the community. Also, the adults could come there to eat dinner, they could come there to dance, they could come for entertainment with the floor shows, and the bar was also a major element for the community, for people to meet, and that was important not just for the hotel, but for the community of Winter Park. Hotels can get very busy and frantic, and people rushing around all the time, and you never felt that way at the Langford. Everything was very relaxed, and people also often remarked about how relaxed they were once they got there and how much they enjoyed their stay. There were employees, as a matter of fact, that were working at the hotel in 1962 that were still working at the hotel when it closed. The hotel was built in 1955, and so by 2000, it was by all means a very old hotel. And even though it had gone through a number of remodelings, it was still the infrastructure of the hotel, such as the air conditioning system and other things. I'm sure it would have required a huge amount of money to make the hotel modern again. That was one reason. The other reason was just the sheer competition of the explosion with Disney World. It took away some of the uniqueness of the Langford Hotel. And also because the focus of tourism in Orlando changed. The type of people that used to come to Winter Park came for relaxation and recreation. And now you've got a different group of people that come to Winter Park in Orlando. They're more interested in the type of entertainment, and the type of tourism has changed completely. I mean, people want the big entertaining shows and all the amenities that Disney World and that whole circus that is the tourist industry in Central Florida now. It was closed in 2001. I'm happy to report there was a special dinner and send-off for Bob Langford, where he was honored by a number of dignitaries in Winter Park and people that he had worked with in city government for years. And a huge turnout, well over 100 people came to pay honor and homage to Bob Langford for not only for being a great hotel man, but also for what he had done for the community and what the Langford Hotel represented to the community of Winter Park. I would describe the Langford Hotel as unique, exotic, relaxing, and just a joyous place to be. It was just from top to bottom. Everything was just amazing, and it was so available for people that lived in Winter Park. And as I said, one of the things that the hotel did a lot of were weddings. And one anecdote I forgot to mention earlier is that I mentioned that Bob Langford was always looking for ways to make the hotel unique. He purchased an English cab and had the emblem of the Langford put on the cab, painted onto the cab. And Jim Lauf, the catering director, and myself would take that cab with a length of red carpet. We would pick up newlyweds at the church. Before they got into the cab, I would roll out the red carpet, so they had this red carpet treatment. It was a tremendous photo opportunity for the photographer that was taking pictures of the wedding. We loaded them into the back of the cab. We drove back to the hotel for their banquet. A just married sign on the back, and it was a fantastic image for people that got married at the hotel, and a very wonderful service that we provided. There was only a compartment for the driver. The other section next to the driver was a luggage compartment. And so in order for me to go with Jim Lauf to pick up the newlyweds at the church, I had to ride open air in the luggage compartment sitting on a folding chair, and with nothing really to prevent me from falling out of the cab. So that was another exciting thing that I did as working at the hotel. And nowadays they wouldn't allow somebody to do that, but that was the way it was back in the 60s. And that was very entertaining for the people that were involved with the weddings. And so my point in bringing up that story was that there were many. We had so many weddings at the hotel, like it was unbelievable. It seemed like almost every week I was working a wedding. Rollins College used the hotel quite a bit. They had conferences there, they had dinners there. Some of the students on occasion had to live at the hotel for a time being if the dormitories were full. And so there was a good connection between Rollins and the Langford Hotel. It was a very important place for the community, and Bob took great pride in what the hotel provided for the community. If it wasn't for Bob Langford, for his vision, for the kind of person that he was, there would have never been a Langford Hotel, and there would never have been the memories that it created for all the people that lived in Winter Park, starting in the 50s up until the time it was closed. In 2003, I had occasion to be in Winter Park, and I made a special effort to go over to the block where the Langford was located. And by 2003, the hotel had been closed and actually had undergone demolition. And I parked the car and walked up to the corner where the hotel, of the intersection there where the hotel would have started. And I just looked out over an empty lot, and I thought, my God, it was such a surreal moment to think that a place that was so important to Winter Park, that affected so many people, that certainly had a big impact on my life, was completely gone. And there was nothing there but an empty lot. And you think, you know, where's the Olympic-sized swimming pool? Where is the treetop room that was a popular banquet room for weddings, because it was all glassed in and you could look out onto the landscape of Winter Park from the treetop room. And it was sad. It was a very sad thing to see, and I know that there were a lot of people that loved the Langford and were upset that it closed. And so I am happy to have this opportunity to tell this story, and I think it's a very important story for the history of Winter Park. And now that the Langford Hotel is gone, people will know, hopefully from my oral history, a little bit more about the Langford and how it was.